started with a locked filing cabinet in the study of a house that was no longer mine, and a single sheet of paper my husband left behind with 9 words written in his tight, deliberate script. And it ended with me standing at the front window of a brand new dog boarding facility called Breach of Trust Boarding, watching a federal agent snap handcuffs onto my daughter-in-law's wrists while I handed a glossy brochure to a Yorkshire Terrier's owner and said, "Welcome to the honest side of the street." I wasn't smiling because I'd won. I was smiling because I'd finally, after 18 months of grief and gaslighting and quiet, methodical vengeance, become the person my husband always knew I could be. My name is Helen. I'm 55 years old, and before any of this happened, I was just about the most ordinary person you could imagine. I'd spent 32 years working my way up from teller to branch manager at a regional credit union, the kind of place where you knew every customer's dog's name, and you could spot a forged signature from 10 feet away just by the hesitation in the loop of a letter L. That skill, that grinding daily attention to the microscopic details of other people's money, is what saved me. I also grew up in a family locksmith shop, sweeping up brass shavings and learning to pick a 5-pin tumbler lock before I could drive a car, because my father believed every woman should know how to get through any door that was slammed in her face. I still remember the very first lock he handed me, a rusted old Schlage deadbolt with only 3 pins, and the way his calloused fingers guided mine on the tension wrench as he said, "You don't fight the mechanism, Helen. You listen to it. Every lock tells you exactly where it wants to go." Those 2 facts, along with the $60,000 pension I emptied out 6 years ago to fund a dream that wasn't mine, are the only pieces of backstory you need. My husband, Arthur, was a quiet, gently brilliant man who'd spent 40 years as a contract fraud attorney before retiring to his garden and his Sudoku puzzles. He had a habit of squinting at documents over the tops of his reading glasses, tapping the paper with his index finger whenever he spotted an inconsistency, and he'd taught me, over decades of dinner-table conversations, that the devil doesn't need a dramatic entrance. He just needs a single misplaced decimal point or a signature that's a little too neat. We had one son, Daniel, a soft-spoken boy who grew into a soft-spoken man, and somehow fell headlong into marriage with a tornado named Marissa. Marissa was all energy and enamel-white smiles and phrases like synergistic vertical integration. She'd worked for a high-end doggy daycare in Scottsdale and came to us 5 years ago with a business plan she swore would print money, an upscale dog boarding franchise called Posh Paws Retreat, featuring private climate-controlled suites, orthopedic memory foam beds, and a pedicure spa. She needed seed capital. I believed in her. Arthur was more cautious, and I'll never forget the quiet way he set down his fork the night she presented the plan and said, "I'll review the contracts, but never sign away what you can't afford to lose." I patted his hand and told him he worried too much. We drained my pension fund, all $60,000, and handed it over on a handshake and a promise of a 50-50 equity split. There was a preliminary partnership agreement drafted, a simple thing Arthur himself reviewed and annotated with 17 sticky notes, but Marissa said her attorney would formalize everything once the first location broke even. We trusted family. That was our first mistake. The second mistake was assuming family ever saw us as anything more than a resource. For 3 years, Posh Paws Retreat thrived. Marissa was, I'll admit it now, a genuine marketing savant. She built a $700,000 a year business out of organic kale treats, and a waiting list so long it looked like a Taylor Swift presale. I received regular, modest dividend checks, always accompanied by a handwritten thank you card from Marissa, and I was content to be the silent partner, the retired mother-in-law who dropped by with homemade snickerdoodles and cooed at the French bulldogs. Arthur, on the other hand, grew quieter. He started spending more time in his study with the door locked, the faint whir of his desktop scanner running late into the night. I assumed it was retirement restlessness. Once I asked him what he was working on, and he just looked at me with those tired gray eyes and said, "Contingencies, love. Every contract needs a fallback clause." I didn't push. I should have pushed. Then, last April, Arthur had a massive stroke while pruning the roses. He was gone before the paramedics could even get a line in. The bottom dropped out of my world. I moved through the next 3 days in a fog of casseroles and condolence cards, barely registering the faces that floated through my living room. Daniel was devastated but functional. Marissa was a flurry of helpfulness, arranging the service, handling the caterers, her hand always on my shoulder, her voice always dripping with the kind of performative sympathy that sounds like a telephone tree recording. The morning after the funeral, while I was still sitting in Arthur's bathrobe because it smelled like him, Marissa and Daniel sat me down at the kitchen table. "Mom," Daniel began, his eyes darting toward Marissa. "We're worried about you being here alone. All these stairs, all these memories. We'd like you to come and stay with us. We've got the guest house ready. It's fully accessible, no steps, and we can take care of you." Marissa picked up seamlessly, her manicured nails tapping the tabletop. "And there's a small mountain of legal paperwork, Helen. Arthur's estate, the house, the business. It's all very tedious, but we want to lighten your load. I have a wonderful estate attorney who can get everything consolidated so you don't have to worry about a thing. We just need a few signatures. It's truly the kindest thing we can do for you right now." I nodded, my voice a papery whisper. I told them I was too tired to think about paperwork just yet. The truth was, a tiny, stubborn gear had already started turning in my head. Arthur's study door was still locked, and I was the only one who knew where he hid the key, tucked inside the hollow porcelain base of the reading lamp we'd bought at a flea market in Santa Fe 30 years ago. They didn't know about that lamp. They didn't know about any of the small, secret places Arthur and I had built into our life together. That night, after they left with promises to bring packing boxes the next day, I made a cup of Earl Grey and walked down the hall to Arthur's study. My hand was trembling so hard I nearly dropped the lamp, but I got the key, slipped it into the lock, and let myself inside. The room smelled of old paper and his aftershave, and the chair was still angled toward the window the way he'd left it. I stood there for a long moment, letting the grief roll through me, and then I went to the filing cabinet. Arthur had always been meticulously organized, but the top drawer was locked, and the key wasn't on his ring. There wasn't a key at all. This was a specialty lock he'd installed himself, a high-security Medico with 6 pins and a sidebar, the kind that takes a locksmith with an electronic pick gun a full hour to manipulate. But I wasn't standard. I remembered a fragment of conversation from years ago, Arthur laughing and saying, "If something ever happens to me, the combination for the backup safe is the date you made me watch that terrible action movie on our first anniversary." I smiled, tears cutting tracks through the dust on my cheeks, and walked to the bookshelf. Behind a row of leather-bound legal volumes was a small wall safe, its dial dusty. I closed my eyes and cast back to that night in 1992, the two of us sharing a bucket of popcorn in a theater that no longer exists, watching a gloriously stupid film about a cop trapped in a skyscraper. The date had been June 14th, our anniversary. I spun the digits, 06-14-92. The safe clicked open. Inside was a single manila envelope labeled in Arthur's handwriting. "For Helen, only if I'm gone." My hands were shaking as I opened it. There was a small, unassuming object at the bottom, a cheap promotional keychain flash drive shaped like a dog bone, the kind Posh Paws had given out at a trade show. And there was a document, a color photocopy of a partnership agreement for Posh Paws Retreat LLC. At first glance it looked legitimate, complete with signatures and a notary stamp. But my trained eye caught it immediately. My signature was traced. The fluid line was gone, replaced by the slow, deliberate drag of a pen following a lightbox template, with uniform pressure and those telltale micro-tremors you see when someone is focusing more on not making a mistake than on writing naturally. The ink didn't flow and feather into the paper the way a live signature does. It sat on top, like a mask. Beneath the signature was a clause I'd never seen before, stating that in exchange for a one-time capital contribution of $5,000, I, Helen Beatrice Aldridge, irrevocably forfeited all future equity and profit participation in the business. The notary date was from 3 years prior, the same month Marissa had taken me out for a spa day and asked me to sign a blank greeting card for her assistant's birthday present. She must have traced my signature from the card, then composited it onto the forged document. The cold calculation of it made my stomach clench. Draped over the photocopy was a sticky note with 9 words in tight blue ink. "Do not trust them. Save yourself. Find Preston." I sat on the floor of Arthur's study, the cold seeping through my robe, and I read that note 17 times. He'd known. My quiet architect of a husband had seen the betrayal coming before it had even fully bloomed, and he'd built a countermeasure I didn't yet understand. I slipped the dog bone flash drive into my pocket, returned the envelope to the safe, and walked back to the kitchen with the photocopy clutched against my chest. I spent the next 3 hours at Arthur's laptop, decrypting the drive. It contained a forensic audit of the forged agreement, complete with spectral imaging analysis that mapped the exact points of tracing, an ink chromatography report showing the pen wasn't manufactured until 18 months after the document's supposed date, and a notarized affidavit from an independent document examiner Arthur had hired months before his stroke. There was also a carefully structured legal memo outlining a dead man's switch procedure with the bank's fraud unit. Arthur had been gathering evidence, building a trap one meticulous layer at a time. He'd just run out of time before he could spring it himself. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, the dog bone drive plugged into my old laptop, and I silently promised him I would finish what he started. The next morning, when Marissa and Daniel arrived to begin the consolidation of my life, I was dressed, composed, and wearing the soft, slightly vacant expression of a woman whose memory had gone foggy with grief. They didn't know I'd spent the pre-dawn hours memorizing every line of that forensic report. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the best revenge is a well-documented paper trail. The first stage of the manipulation was so smooth, it was almost elegant. Marissa moved me into the guest house on their property, a pretty little cottage behind the main house with exposed beams and a kitchenette. She framed it as a temporary measure while they handled the estate complexities. Daniel came by every evening with a plate of whatever Marissa had cooked, which was usually something expensive and underseasoned from a meal kit service, and he'd sit with me for an hour, his eyes constantly flicking to his phone. They were hemorrhaging money. I realized later, trying to project an image of flawless success while drowning in debt and a ballooning business loan they'd taken out against the Posh Paws brand, a loan I had never been told about, a loan my forged signature likely secured. Every few days, Marissa would appear with a new document for me to sign. A durable power of attorney, a quitclaim deed on my house, a stock transfer form. She'd lay them on the little breakfast table with a pen already uncapped and angled toward me. I'd squint at the paper, shake my head with a wobbly smile, and say something like, "My goodness, all this legalese makes my head spin. Arthur always handled this stuff. Can't we just wait until I'm feeling a bit steadier?" Marissa's eye would twitch almost imperceptibly, but she'd pat my hand and say, "Of course, sweetie. No rush at all." Then she'd gather the documents and leave, and I'd hear her hissing into her phone on the patio the moment she thought I was out of earshot. One afternoon, about 10 days in, she brought a mobile notary to the guest house, a nervous young man with a stamp and a logbook. The document was a simple asset verification form that would have given her access to the remainder of my pension account. I felt my pulse quicken, but I stayed in character. I poured us all glasses of iced tea, settled into the chair, and as I reached for the pen, I let my hand shake so violently that I knocked the entire glass onto the papers, soaking them through. I gasped and launched into a flurry of apologies, dabbing at the ruined forms with a napkin, muttering about my trembling hands and the new medication my doctor had prescribed for anxiety. The notary backed away, looking uncomfortable. Marissa's smile froze into a rictus of fury, but she recovered in seconds, laughing it off. "Oh, honey, accidents happen. We'll reschedule." That night, I added the notary's name to a little spiral notebook I'd started keeping under my mattress, a log of every document, every date, every lie. I was building my own paper trail, and it felt like breathing. I played the role of the helpless, foggy widow so convincingly that I almost convinced myself. But at night, when the motion sensor lights clicked off and the main house went dark, I became someone else. I became the forensic auditor I'd trained myself to be during all those years at the credit union, the woman who'd once testified in federal court about a check-kiting scheme because I'd noticed the defendant used wrong-colored ink. I began my undercover investigation with the simplest tool, observation. Week 1, in the guest house, I noticed the pattern. Every morning at precisely 7:45, Marissa received a phone call that made her voice drop to a low, hissing register. She'd pace the back patio, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand making sharp, cutting gestures. I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and my Sudoku puzzle, and I'd listen. Fragments. "No, the drawdown isn't cleared yet. We can service the note if she just signs the property over. Don't you dare call the house again." On day 4, a flashy black sedan pulled up and a man in a suit that fit too well got out, holding a clipboard. He and Marissa argued by the side gate. I saw him gesture angrily toward the building, and I heard her say, "Another 6 weeks. The collateral is sitting in a trust right now, but I'll have the release signature by month's end." Collateral? Trust. That was Arthur's language, not hers. I filed the words away. The household accident that gave me a reason to fix something happened on day 9. The garbage disposal in the guest house kitchen seized up with a horrible grinding noise. I could have called maintenance, but I saw an opportunity. I opened the undersink cabinet and found the problem. A teaspoon had fallen into the grinding chamber. I retrieved my tool kit from the car, the one I'd kept since college, a battered red metal box with a faded sticker from my father's shop on the lid, and within 15 minutes I'd freed the blades, reset the thermal overload button, and had the sink running again. I did it with the door open, and I made sure Marissa saw me from the patio. She wandered over, coffee cup in hand, looking bemused. "Well, look at you, Handy Helen. I didn't know you could do that." "Oh, I'm just full of surprises," I said, keeping my voice light. "My dad owned a locksmith shop when I was a kid. I learned to fix just about anything with a motor or a tumbler. He used to say a woman who can pick a lock and balance a checkbook never has to ask permission for anything." She laughed, a little too quickly. "A locksmith's daughter? That's adorable. Well, if the main house alarm panel starts acting up, I know who to call." The remark about the alarm panel was the key I needed. I filed it away too, and I started planning my next move. A week later, I manufactured a reason to enter the main house unsupervised. I waited until both Marissa and Daniel left for a charity gala she'd been fretting about for days, a black tie event with a silent auction to benefit a local animal shelter, which was a masterclass in irony given how she treated the humans in her own pack. She'd spent the afternoon in a flurry of hairspray and Spanx, and when their car finally pulled out of the driveway, I gave them 20 minutes, then slipped out of the guest house. I'd been told to stay put and order dinner through a delivery app. Instead, I pulled on a pair of latex gloves, grabbed my father's old leather roll-up lockpick kit, and walked to the main house's back door. The alarm panel was a standard model, the kind that beeps a 30-second entry delay when you open the door. I'd brought a small rare earth magnet and a strip of aluminum foil, a trick my father taught me for disabling magnetic reed switches on older models. I pressed the magnet against the sensor housing, slipped the foil into the gap, and heard the faint click of the circuit breaking. The panel stayed dark. I was in. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I moved through the kitchen, past the framed photos of Marissa shaking hands with local business owners, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Marissa's home office was at the end of a hallway that smelled like vanilla plugins and ambition. The door had a keypad lock, a cheap residential model with a numeric touchpad. I recognized it immediately. It was a Lock-Easy 5000, the same brand we'd used for the safe deposit box room at my second credit union branch, the one where the regional manager had never bothered to change the factory defaults because he said it was too much trouble. The factory default master code for that model, a code most homeowners never change, was 1-2-3-4-5-6. I punched it in. The lock clicked open. I was in. The office was a disaster of filing cabinets, whiteboards covered with profit projections, and a desk buried under invoices and stacks of promotional materials for a new franchise location. But I went straight for the one thing that mattered, a locked filing cabinet in the corner, identical to the one in Arthur's study. This time I used my picks. I knelt on the carpet, my knees complaining, and worked the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway while I raked the pins with a half diamond. I could feel each pin set, a tiny vibration through the metal, and after about 90 seconds, the plug turned with a satisfying thunk. Inside were hanging folders labeled with years. I found the one marked Corporate Records, and there, nestled between tax filings and vendor contracts, was the original of the forged partnership agreement. I laid it on the desk and examined it with a jeweler's loupe I'd tucked into my pocket. The tracing marks were faint but unmistakable under magnification, slight grooves in the paper where a stylus had pressed down before the ink was applied. The notary stamp's serial number didn't match the notary's logbook for that date. I'd already checked the state database late one night from my phone, using the guest Wi-Fi while Marissa was asleep. This document was a complete lie. I photographed every page with my phone, making sure to capture the edge of the paper and the folder label for chain of custody context. I also found a stack of unsecured loan documents showing that Marissa had leveraged the Posh Paw's intellectual property, the name, the logo, the proprietary booking software, as collateral for a $400,000 line of credit. My forged signature was on those, too, right above a notary block that listed a notary who had actually died 2 years before the date on the stamp. She'd been so sloppy, so arrogant in her assumption that no one would ever look. She'd also taken out a massive key person life insurance policy on Daniel, naming the business as the sole beneficiary, a policy I found tucked in a folder labeled risk mitigation. My stomach turned to ice. I photographed that too, then carefully replaced everything, locked the cabinet, and left the office exactly as I'd found it. I wiped the keypad with a microfiber cloth, removed the magnet from the alarm sensor, and slipped back into the night, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my temples. The next morning, I contacted the only ally Arthur had left me, Preston Vance. I called him from a burner phone I'd bought at a gas station, using a prepaid card with cash. The call lasted 12 minutes, but Preston insisted we meet in person. 2 days later, I slipped away under the pretense of a doctor's appointment and met him at a diner 3 towns over, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone Han. Preston was in his late 60s, a tall man with a quiet, deliberate way of speaking, and he brought a leather satchel full of files. Over cups of lukewarm coffee, he laid it all out. 6 months before his stroke, Arthur had walked into the bank with a sealed envelope containing the entire forensic package I'd found on the flash drive, plus a video deposition recorded on a thumb drive, and a sworn affidavit detailing his suspicions. He'd instructed Preston to file a sealed complaint with the state's Financial Crimes Division if anything ever happened to him, but to give me, Helen, a chance to trigger the trap in a way that would maximize the legal impact. The plan was elegantly simple. The forged documents had all been used to secure loans and transfer assets. If I, the victim, could force a controlled confrontation where Marissa demanded my signature on a new, updated document that rested on the fraudulent one, and if I refused in the presence of a notary and a recording, the bank's fraud unit would instantly flag the entire chain of forgeries. The original forensic evidence, plus the recordings Arthur had made, would be unsealed. Federal authorities were already watching, Preston said, but they needed the final nail, a live, witnessed refusal to validate the fraud. The dead man's switch wasn't a single document. It was a procedural mechanism that would crash the entire fraudulent architecture the moment I said no. Preston slid a tiny digital voice recorder across the table, disguised as a tube of lip balm. "Carry this with you," he said. "When she finally brings you to the bank, I'll make sure I'm the notary in that room. We'll have bank security cameras rolling, and my own compliance team will be in an adjacent office monitoring the audio feed. The minute you say the refusal phrase, we lock the documents and the DOJ moves in." He paused, his hand covering mine. Arthur was a good man. He spent his last months making sure you'd have a way out. All you have to do is play the long game a little longer. I tucked the recorder into my purse, thanked him, and drove back to the guest house with a strange, steady calm settling over me. I had a plan. I just needed Marissa to get desperate enough to play her hand. But I also needed to test the depth of Marissa's humanity, because somewhere in my broken mother's heart, I still held the faint hope that Daniel's wife, the woman I'd funded and supported, had some shred of decency left. So I staged the maximum cruelty beat. 3 weeks into my stay, I arranged a fake medical episode. I'd been having occasional, mild heart palpitations for years, nothing serious, just benign PVCs, and Marissa knew about them because Daniel had mentioned them. I waited for a quiet Sunday afternoon. I'd planted the seeds over dinner the night before, casually mentioning that I felt a little fluttering in my chest again, and I made sure to leave my leather folio. The one I'd told them contained the final estate documents she'd been begging me to sign, sitting conspicuously on the coffee table. Inside the folio was nothing but blank printer paper, but it looked official, thick and legal-sized with a red "Sign Here" tab I'd fabricated. On Sunday, while Marissa and Daniel were both in the main house, I walked into their living room, dropped a glass of water on the floor so it shattered dramatically, and clutched my chest. I let out a strangled gasp and collapsed onto the Persian rug, one arm flung out toward the folio. Daniel shot up from the couch, face white. "Mom!" He scrambled toward me, his hands hovering over my shoulders. But Marissa didn't move. Her eyes didn't even track to my body on the floor. She saw the briefcase I'd dropped, and her whole body oriented toward it like a compass needle swinging to true north. While I lay there, motionless, forcing my breathing to go shallow, she stepped directly over my legs, the point of her high heel grazing my shin hard enough to leave a bruise I'd find the next morning. She snatched the briefcase, popped the latches with a practiced snap, and rifled through the papers inside. When she saw they were blank, she let out a guttural, furious sound, a noise I can only describe as a predator's frustration. She didn't look at me. She didn't check my pulse. She simply said, "Daniel, deal with her. I need to find those forms," and her footsteps retreated down the hall, sharp and quick, like a nail gun going off. I kept my eyes closed for a few more seconds, my heart actually racing now, but not from any medical condition. Daniel was kneeling beside me, his hand on my forehead, his voice trembling. "Mom, can you hear me?" "Mom, please." I opened my eyes, gave him a long, sad look, and whispered, "I'm okay," just stood up too fast. The last faint tether of family loyalty, the one I'd kept knotted around my conscience for my son's sake, snapped cleanly in that moment. I had seen the truth. I was not a mother-in-law to Marissa. I was a breathing obstacle with a signature attached. She would have let me die on that rug if it meant getting her hands on a valid power of attorney. That night, I forgave myself in advance for everything that was about to happen. The confrontation happened 2 weeks later. Marissa had finally run out of patience. The business loan was coming due, the lender was making aggressive threats, and the only way to refinance was to get a clean, unconditional ownership structure that excluded me entirely. She booked a 10 a.m. appointment at First Mercantile Bank in a private conference room with a notary present. She told me it was just a formality, a simple amendment to the original agreement that would protect the business if something happened to me. She'd even dressed me that morning, selecting a soft beige cardigan and sensible slacks, patting my hair into place with a brush that smelled like her expensive shampoo. She drove me to the bank with Daniel in the back seat, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her smile stretched too tight. The conference room was all glass and chrome, the kind of room where deals are made or broken in the space of a single signature. Preston Vance was already there, seated at the head of the table in a dark suit, a leather-bound binder in front of him, a small recording indicator light blinking green on the edge of his laptop. Another man, the bank's general counsel, sat to his left, and a representative from the fraud compliance unit, a woman with a severe bun and an expression of polite stone, stood near the door. Marissa laid out the documents with a flourish, a stack of stock transfer forms, a settlement statement, and the cornerstone of the entire file, the original forged partnership agreement encased in a protective plastic sleeve. She pushed a gold pen toward me. "Okay, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with synthetic warmth. "Just sign everywhere there's a yellow flag. Then Preston here will notarize it, and we can all go get lunch at that little French place you love." I picked up the pen. I turned it over in my fingers, letting the silence stretch. Then I set it down very gently on the polished wood. I folded my hands on the table, straightened my spine, and looked directly at the camera lens above Preston's shoulder. "Before I sign anything," I said, my voice no longer the wavering whisper of the grieving widow, but the clear, measured tone of a woman who'd spent 32 years reading legal contracts, "I'd like to ask a question. Marissa, is this the original partnership agreement from 3 years ago? The one my signature is supposed to be on? The one that says I forfeited my entire equity stake for a one-time gift of $5,000? Marissa's smile flickered but held, her eyes darting once toward the door. "Of course it is, sweetie. It's been in the corporate records since day one. You just forgot, that's all. Grief plays tricks on the mind." I pulled a piece of photo paper from my purse, a high-resolution enlargement of the signature I'd photographed with my jeweler's loupe. I slid it across the table, the image crisp and damning. "Then you won't mind explaining why my signature on this document shows clear tracing artifacts, why the ink analysis Arthur commissioned before he died proves the pen used wasn't even manufactured until 18 months after that date, and why the notary whose stamp is on this page has no entry in her logbook for that day. I've also recently learned that the notary you used on 3 separate loan documents died 2 years before the dates on those stamps. Arthur left me a forensic audit, Marissa. I've seen the spectral imaging report. I've read the affidavit from the document examiner. I know everything. Her face went from sweet to stone cold in 3 seconds flat, the mask dropping so fast I could almost hear it hit the floor. You're confused, Helen. Grief does that. It's sad, really. Daniel, honey, tell your mother she's confused. Daniel opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was staring at the photo, then at me, then at his wife, his whole world visibly cracking like thin ice. His hands were shaking. I stood up. I leaned forward, both hands flat on the table, and I delivered my quotable line, the one that still gives me a cold thrill when I think about it. You taught me that forgery is remarkably easy when you think no one is paying attention. But teaching a retired credit union manager to spot a fake signature is like teaching a hawk to spot a rabbit. I'm not signing anything. This entire structure is a fraud, and every loan you secured with my name is about to come due. Marissa lunged for the documents, her nails scraping the table, but Preston's hand was already pressing a speed dial button on his phone. The door to the conference room opened, and 3 people entered. 2 men in dark suits with federal badges clipped to their belts, and a woman in a navy pantsuit, who identified herself as a special agent with the state's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They had a warrant for Marissa's arrest on charges of forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, loan fraud, and conspiracy, as well as a seizure order for the Posh Paws intellectual property based on the now unsealed evidence package Arthur had filed. The general counsel began reading a prepared statement about the immediate freezing of all business and personal accounts. It was a perfect, quiet ambush, the kind Arthur would have orchestrated if he'd been there. Marissa's scream of pure, animal rage echoed off the glass walls as she was handcuffed, her perfectly styled hair coming loose, her heels skidding on the tile. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, tears streaming down his face. I walked over to him, kissed the top of his head, and said, I'll always love you, but I need you to know that your wife stepped over my dying body to get to a briefcase full of blank paper. Think about what that means. I left the bank through the employee exit, Preston guiding me with a steady hand on my elbow, and I didn't look back. The aftermath was not swift, but it was thorough. Marissa was charged with multiple felonies, including forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, loan fraud, and tax evasion. The trial was a spectacle, and the evidence Arthur had meticulously compiled was so devastating that her attorney urged a plea deal after the first day of expert testimony. She was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, and her assets, everything she'd built on the back of that forged signature, were seized and liquidated to satisfy the creditors, including the $400,000 loan and penalties. The life insurance policy on Daniel was voided. Daniel filed for divorce within a month of the arrest and entered intensive therapy. He and I have been slowly rebuilding something, meeting for coffee every Sunday at a diner that isn't the one where I met Preston, talking about everything except the trial. It will never be what it was. Some cracks are too structural to ignore, but he's my son, and I won't abandon him to the wreckage. But the piece of this story that gives me the most complicated sense of satisfaction is the intellectual property. Because the Posh Paws brand had been used as collateral for fraudulent loans, the rights to the name, the logo, the proprietary online booking system, all of it reverted to the victim of the fraud. Me. The court awarded me full ownership of the franchise's intellectual property as restitution, a ruling that made the local business journal. I sold the house Arthur and I had shared, used a portion of the proceeds to lease a small commercial space directly across the street from the now-shuttered Posh Paws retreat location, a building that had once been a dry cleaner's and still smelled faintly of solvent when I signed the papers. I hired a former Posh Paws kennel manager who had always been kind to me and who had quit after Marissa denied her a raise for a 3rd year in a row, and together we scrubbed every surface, painted the walls a calm sage green, and built the boarding facility I wished had existed all along. I named it Breach of Trust Boarding. The logo is a paw print with a tiny, elegant crack running through it, designed by a local artist who heard my story through the grapevine and offered to do it for free. Every single customer who walks through the door receives a welcome packet that includes a professionally printed, legally vetted brochure. Inside the brochure is the full story. How my daughter-in-law forged my signature to steal my life savings, how forensic document analysis proved the fraud, and how this business was built on the principle that when someone tries to bury you in paperwork, you rise up with a paper trail of your own. It's not petty. It's truth in advertising. Within 8 months, I had poached 80% of Marissa's former client base. People care about their dogs, and when they learn their beloved boarding facility was built on financial fraud, they're eager to support the alternative, especially when the alternative offers complimentary snickerdoodles baked from my grandmother's recipe and a loyalty program called the Justice Partners Club. I've had clients come in, read the brochure in the lobby, and actually cry before they handed me their leash. One woman, a longtime Posh Paws customer with a geriatric golden retriever, said, "I always thought something felt off about that place. Now I know I was right." She's been a weekly boarder ever since. I still think about Arthur every day. I go home to a smaller house now, a cottage with a porch swing and a garden that's just the right size for one. On my mantel is the tiny, cheap dog bone flash drive encased in a glass block, and beneath it is a framed reproduction of the 9-word note. I look at it whenever I start to second-guess myself, and I remember that the quietest people in a room are often the ones holding the biggest receipts. My husband didn't leave me with a grand fortune or a dramatic, cinematic revenge plot. He left me with meticulous documentation, a dead man's switch that only needed a steady voice to trigger it, and the unshakable knowledge that when someone asks you to sign away your worth, you say no, and you say it on the record. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? A betrayal that rewired your entire understanding of family? How did you handle it? I'd genuinely like to know, because sometimes the only way to process your own story is to hear someone else's. If you appreciated this tale of forensic revenge and four-legged second chances, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We believe that integrity isn't just a word, it's a long game you win by paying attention. Until next time, keep your eyes on the fine print and your heart open only to those who have earned the combination.